Hello everyone, welcome back to another video where today I want to take a look at this Deadline article that's been doing the rounds today that's basically saying why Disney apparently ditched Doctor Who, according to several of their industry insiders. So we're going to be taking a look at this and I'm going to be giving you my thoughts as we go through it. So feel free to like the video if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new, that'd be greatly appreciated, and let's dive right in. Why Disney ditched Doctor Who? Sources say ratings, big ticket budget, and MAGA politics were factors in BBC deal failing to regenerate. I can't wait for the comments on this video. Exclusive, Dana Walden was in London earlier this month, but it's safe to say that renewing Doctor Who was not among the Disney Entertainment chief's priorities. Sources have been telling Deadline for more than a year that Disney has been lukewarm on the sci-fi series, and by Tuesday afternoon it was official. The BBC confirmed that its Doctor Who co-production agreement had vaporised. What was conceived as a plan to marvelise the franchise did not translate into a big bang. Instead, the partnership has died with a whimper, with Disney not even putting out a statement to mark its passing. So what doomed the Doctor Who deal and what comes next? That's a very good point. Disney themselves said nothing about this deal ending. The BBC confirmed, Disney are out and Disney are basically corroborating that, but are keeping it basically as quiet as possible. Deadline has spoken to multiple sources in Doctor Who's orbit who say the Disney deal fell apart for a variety of reasons, including over the Cutie Gatwa show's failure to break out from its established fan base and its big ticket budget. Others suspect that fears of woke backlash may be a factor as Doctor Who embraces its diverse storytelling under showrunner Russell T Davies. So the first reason given is that, quote, it wasn't for the long term. It was pretty apparent from early on that this was not for the long term, says a former Disney executive. Everybody got the impression that it wasn't doing what it needed to do on Disney Plus to be sustained. Another person close to Doctor Who adds, the writing had been on the wall for ages. There has been a complete lack of enthusiasm over at Disney. And this is something I've been saying for a while. Like, the writing was on the wall for the Disney deal, I want to say, for about the last year. I feel like we've all sort of known deep down that that was the case. It's interesting to hear, an apparent former Disney executive say that they all got the impression that it wasn't going to be a long-term thing, in spite of the fact that Russell T Davies said that they were going to be yearly series and they were going to be building out this empire. So it's interesting to see kind of from Disney's perspective them saying, oh yeah, this wasn't really a thing for the long term, whereas, on the BBC and the Bad Wolf end, it was very much kind of sold as this, this long-term kind of agreement for the future. Whether that is just PR speak and them just saying, oh, well, we never intended it for the long term, so that us dropping it now is fair enough, or whether it is more of a case of they genuinely didn't see it as a long-term investment, is interesting. I mean, it is worth noting here that it does say former Disney executive, not current Disney executive, which implies to me that they probably would be a bit more truthful about it. It's worth saying as well that I believe Disney management changed in between this deal happening. When this deal was announced, it was under former Disney CEO Bob Chapek, I believe, and then a couple of years later, Bob Iger returned to the role as Disney CEO, which I imagine brought a fair few shake-ups. So it's possible as well that different executives could have signed off on the deal, and when new executives came in, they weren't exactly eager to continue it. Announced in October 2022, Disney's agreement to co-produce Doctor Who was inked at the height of the streaming wars, just weeks before Bob Iger walked back into the building and started scaling back spending. So yeah, that's what I was saying, basically how Bob Iger came back in and was like, we're spending way too much on Disney Plus, it's a bit of a money pit, let's cut back. And obviously something that they don't own, like Doctor Who, that's not really doing amazingly as far as we can make out, is probably going to be the first for the chopping block. It was hailed at the time as an unprecedented pact bringing together two giants of entertainment, but the ex-Disney insider says they soon detected regret at spending so much on Doctor Who. The show's budget was between $6 million, $8.5 million, and $8 million per episode. We understand putting the value of the deal as $168 million. Now, I will say there have been a couple of discrepancies here. I remember there being a similar report from Deadline saying it was going to be £10 million per episode, which Russell T Davies pretty firmly rebuked. $6 million, I mean, that is a fair bit less, so maybe that is more accurate. But I'm going to sort of hold my breath on the actual numbers because I don't think anyone's really going to know the details of that other than people very close to the production. So I'm going to take that with a grain of salt. But I mean, it wouldn't surprise me though if the reasoning was still sound that Disney kind of thought, well, why are we spending this money on a show that we don't own, on a service that doesn't really make money as it is, on a show that isn't exactly huge, when we could just, put it into our own stuff. I think that probably was the thought process. The former Mouse House employee notes a lack of marketing firepower behind the brand, nowhere near the might of Marvel or Star Wars, creating something of a chicken and egg scenario whereby it became harder for Doctor Who to cut through to American audiences. It certainly wasn't being shouted about as a big success, adds this person. Interesting though, because if I'm an executive, right, and this is me thinking about this, I know full well that Doctor Who doesn't have the brand power of Marvel or Star Wars, but that's exactly why you invest in it, to give it that weight. And I did somewhat feel that after season 1, particularly early season 1, the marketing on the Disney end completely dried up. I remember seeing, TikToks of the New York subway being decorated out into Doctor Who stuff for Disney Plus, and then after that, it was pretty much just silence on their end, and it was just released on Disney, and that was it. So yeah, very much kind of do feel that they didn't really put their full weight behind it. I mean, let me know. I'm not in America or in other international markets. But let me know, did you guys see much Disney Plus marketing for Doctor Who in your territories? From what I saw, there was quite a large push for season 1, but then after that, kind of just nothing after that from what I saw. But again, you guys may have different views on that, so let me know. An executive at BBC Studios, which owns Doctor Who and oversees international sales, said it never felt like Disney were making much of a deal about the iconic sci-fi series, which had been on our screens for more than 60 years. Disney sources have countered this, with one telling the Times London that a lot of marketing muscle was put behind the show. Okay, so this is interesting. You've got BBC Studios execs saying that I don't think a lot was put behind it, whereas Disney is saying actually a lot was put behind it. I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. I think they probably started out putting in a lot behind it, but when it became apparent that it probably wasn't going to do Marvel or Star Wars numbers, which anyone with a brain can tell you it was never going to do, then they probably pulled back. Next one, ratings flop. Doctor Who's performance has been far from stellar in the US. This year's season failed to register in Nielsen and Luminate's streaming charts. Meanwhile, the entertainment strategy guide brand Doctor Who debut on Disney Plus as one of the flops of 2024. There was also a serious lack of buzz around the series, which only managed one primetime Emmy for outstanding choreography for scripted programming in 2025 during its time on Disney Plus. On the BBC, it has been alarming. Drop-off in viewers. Season 15 averaged 3.8 million viewers, according to gold standard 28-day viewing figures from BARB, the UK's official ratings agency. This represents a decline of 1 million to the prior season, the first starring Gatwa, and produced by Jane Tranter's Bountiful Studios. Both Gatwa seasons were down on Jodie Whittaker's concluding season in 2021, watched by 5.2 million people, a period that was not considered to be vintage Doctor Who. The ratings were not up to much. Someone involved in the series ruefully acknowledges. Yeah, so I mean, it is true the ratings were not stellar for, season 1 and 2. That is, undeniable, really. I don't think that they were as catastrophic as some people say, because I mean, look, BBC are still making the show, so if the ratings were that low, they probably have cut their losses at this stage. What I will say, however, is I think one of the big reasons why ratings were so low, at least in the UK, is because of the ridiculous scheduling. Midnight for the UK for a TV show is just not really the norm. Yes, it is the case for streaming shows, but Doctor Who, as much as they try to make it one, is not really a streaming show, it's a TV show. No one's getting up at midnight to watch, a random TV show on BBC One. It's not happening, or BBC iPlayer in this case. And I think that had a hugely detrimental impact. And same goes doubly for season 2, 8 AM, which is even worse than midnight, some may argue, because at least midnight, feels like somewhat of an event. 8 AM very much kind of gives the vibe of a show that's been just sort of dropped, first thing in the morning. So I think that the scheduling was a massive kind of detrimental factor. And part of me wonders if the 8 AM thing was kind of the BBC and Disney compromising in the dying sort of days of the relationship. While BBC drama boss Lindsay Salt thanked Disney for being terrific global partners, the Mouse House was not nearly as glowing, with a spokesperson simply confirming the BBC statement and noting that Gatwa's seasons will remain on Disney Plus outside the UK for the time being. Sources tell us that the BBC and Disney had initially planned to make a statement about Doctor Who's future after the premiere of spin-off series The War Between Land and Sea, but Disney decided to move the announcement up. Okay, so this is interesting for a couple of reasons, because obviously that's what we'd heard for the longest time, right? That it was going to be, after War Between Land and Sea, that we would hear an official announcement as to the future of Doctor Who. But according to this, it was Disney who decided to move it up, which is interesting, because I'd always assumed that it was the BBC who kind of got cold feet and were kind of just saying, can we be free to do other things? But actually, according to this at least, it's Disney who are apparently like, you know, just call it quits, you know. So that's interesting to me. I wonder if they were maybe just ready to move on. And I mean, there was rumours as well of, you know, slight differing of opinions as to when War Between was going to air, with Disney wanting it in 2026, but the BBC wanting it in late 2025 for their Christmas schedule. So maybe they just thought, you know what, we'll just cut our losses and call it a day. They've clearly sat down and made a final decision in the last week or so, but it's been on the cards for a very long time, says Tony Jordan, who runs the Doctor Who Appreciation Society and speaks to the show's fanbase every day. I mean, I also do that deadline, and you didn't interview me, but I kid. Jordan says Whovians believed Gatwa's seasons have been patchy. There were some strong episodes in both, but both two-part finales were not particularly well regarded. That is just true. Yeah, I mean, I do think there were some episodes that were good in this era, but particularly the finales were not great. Which is a shame, because I'm in one of them. He explains a lack of episodes made it difficult for audiences to get to know Ncuti and his companions to really develop their storylines. I think this is also true. The 8-episode thing is not enough for the style of series that they were doing. And I think if the 8-episode thing is to be continued, they need to either like rehaul the format or, you know, do something completely different with it, maybe make it serialized, because doing a kind of episodic thing with an overarching arc works when you've got 13 or 14 episodes and a lot more leg room. It doesn't work when you've got 8 episodes. It just doesn't. Gatwa's experience felt somewhat fraught. He left after 2 seasons and blamed burnout, with the 33-year-old saying, "I was getting old and my body was getting tired." A Doctor Who source says the show suffered because Gatwa never fully embraced the role. There is more to the role than performing, this person says. You have to be an ambassador for the brand and embrace that you will be that generation's Doctor. Matt Smith and David Tennant fully understood the responsibility it carried. Interesting. I don't know whether I would go as far as to say that, like, Gatwa didn't really embrace the role. I would argue that he was never really given the opportunity to embrace the role. Obviously, this just says a Doctor Who source, so who that is, you know, take that with a massive grain of salt. But for me, I would argue that, like, he never really got to do, like, Children in Need or comic relief and all of these things that are an important aspect of the Doctor being seen as a hero to children year-round rather than just when the show is on. You could also argue that maybe though that was because he wasn't around long enough to do those things, but at the same time, you know, he did do 2 years in the role, and at that point, you know, there wasn't a single kind of, like, initiative on, like, Children in Need or comic relief or any of these other things, you know. There were a couple of Graham Norton appearances for him, but that was kind of it. Like, there wasn't really this sense that he was a BBC icon outside of when the show was on, you know. And I think that that is important. Like, I remember when, you know, Matt Smith was the Doctor, and you'd have, like, constant little shorts, you'd have constant little sketches for every TV show going, you know, Children in Need and Blue Peter and comic relief, like I say. Whereas Ncuti didn't get any of that, you know, like, there just wasn't any of that. There was one Blue Peter thing, I think, around season 1 time, and, you know, that was kind of it. And I somewhat feel that it's slightly unfair to say that he never really embraced being the show's ambassador, when I'd argue that he didn't really get the opportunity to do that, like, I would say. Like, if anything, Russell was probably more the front man of the marketing when it came to Doctor Who on these chat shows and panel shows, which, look, he is a big part of it, don't get me wrong, but I do kind of feel like Ncuti often didn't feel like as much of a presence. Another well-placed industry source says Doctor Who became too woke for Trump's USA. Oh, here we go. And this is where the comments are going to get fun. And this was a factor in Disney minds when it came to renewal. Under Writer Davis, the series has cast transgender actress Yasmin Finney, featured drag queen Jinx Monsoon as the villain, and played host to a historic gay kiss between Gatwa and Jonathan Groff, which drew some complaints from BBC viewers. It's worth saying a tiny amount. It's worth saying actually complained. I believe it was in like the tens. You know, it was a tiny amount of people who actually objected to that. However, it's worth saying that this deal was originally announced in 2022 and was likely finalised probably in 2021. And it's worth saying that the environment in America in specific, which is obviously Disney's main market, in 2021 and in 2025 are very different with Trump's return to the White House. You know, there's kind of this sense that things are slightly going backwards in America when it comes to representation and stuff. And they even say here, Disney is incredibly unlikely to ever admit that politics played a factor in whose cancellation, but Jimmy Kimmel's brief suspension was revealing of the company's desire to minimize MAGA wrath. Obviously, they did go back on that Jimmy Kimmel decision, but if that was enough to kind of, you know, take him off the air temporarily, then I can't imagine that the idea of, you know, trans main characters and, you know, gay kisses and a black lead was necessarily welcomed by the current American administration, if they even knew about it at all, which, I mean, they might not have, I don't know. With Davis yet to commit to future seasons, it's possible that Doctor Who could have dialed down diversity under a Disney renewal, but the fact remains that celebrating difference has always been part of the show's DNA. And this might be slightly controversial, but I don't want Doctor Who to compromise itself for Trump's America. Like, I just don't. You know, I think that the show has always been diverse, whether people, you know, want to say that or not. It has always been an inclusive show, and I think that just to say, like, well, we could dial it down for a renewal, I'd rather they didn't, to be honest. You know, Britain is not America. We have different, you know, cultural kind of ideas when it comes to that sort of stuff. Obviously, there are worrying about people who, you know, are sort of rising up, who maybe feel more similarly to the MAGA people, but, you know, I don't really want British television to be dictated by the whims of the American climate. Does that make sense? I don't think that that's, you know, what should happen, especially given that it is also publicly funded partially. Doctor Who's post-Disney reset, Season 15 concluded on an ambiguous note with Gatwa regenerating into Billie Piper's Rose Tyler, a Doctor Who companion of yesteryear. Jordan speculates this will be temporary, as Davis will use the just announced 2026 Christmas special to tie up loose ends. Beyond that, Jordan thinks fresh blood might be required. Nothing says that Russell will be showrunner from 2027 onwards. He adds it might be time for a new showrunner to take it forwards. Committing to a Christmas special that is still 15 months away buys the BBC time to ponder how to push on now that it's lost a hefty chunk of its Doctor Who budget. It can reset and buys everyone time to make decisions, was how it was characterised by someone close to the series. The former Disney executive reckons the BBC will be able to spend at most £2.5 to £3 million per episode, which would work out around £1 million per episode from the BBC's own pocket, and any additional coming from BBC Studios distribution advance in what is a tricky market for drama funding. So yeah, I mean, 2.5 to 3 million, I believe, was kind of the speculated budgets for the Jodie era, so I wouldn't be, you know, particularly averse to that. To be completely frank, I didn't really notice an insane difference between the Gatwa era and, like, the Jodie era. Like, yeah, there were a couple more VFX shots and stuff, but, like, largely, I didn't really see much of a difference. The only time it honestly felt to me like, oh, this is an episode that could only be done in the Disney era with Disney money was Lux. That's the only time I can think of where it really felt like, oh yeah, this is making use of more money. Outside of that, I don't really feel like it really applied to much else. Once you've gone up, it's always difficult to go back down. The source says you can cut budgets to a certain degree, but not by much. Is the BBC really going to stump up even more for something showing decline? Others pointed out that some of Davis's cheaper episodes were his best, such as season 14's 73 Yards, which was praised by critics and Whovians. Budget limitations used to help with the idiosyncrasies of the show. As an executive who used to work on Doctor Who, big budgets can cause a problem. A huge variety of voices tend to push towards the mediocre, but then the budget was nowhere near as big as shows like The Mandalorian, so they were stuck in the middle. You can have planets, flying cars, robots, but ultimately you are always going to get better versions elsewhere. This is a very important thing to point out. As much as the budget was big for Doctor Who, by Doctor Who, and by British TV standards, it's still, from what we know, not a patch on what Disney would spend on their own projects. And I agree, I think some of the best stuff in this era was the stuff that was probably the cheapest. 73 Yards, Dot and Bubble, neither of which feel like, massive spenders in that regard. I'd also say something like The Well as well. That literally has a villain that doesn't really exist. So like, and that could have definitely been done without Disney money. Same goes for something like, Lucky Day. And a lot of these stories, yeah, it's nice to have the extra boost in budget, but it's not really essential. Like, I can imagine a version of The Well that existed in like the Capaldi era. You know what I mean? Maybe the space base that they'll end up in is a bit smaller, but they still do quarry work in that episode. So like, it's not impossible to imagine some of those episodes existing in other eras. 73 Yards is another good example of that. Finding another American buyer for Doctor Who will be tough going. The ex-Disney source adds, while striking piecemeal deals across Europe and Latin America may prove difficult for a show that is ultimately quintessentially British, how do you suddenly convince a buyer to take Doctor Who when it hasn't been on their platform for so long? The source questions. But it is still possible. We understand that prior to Disney Plus and BBC striking the co-pro deal, an alternative option was presented to then BBC drama boss Piers Wenger, which would have raised up to $5 million an episode without input from a big American player. This plan could be revisited. Interesting. So the BBC Studios executive strikes a positive tone and thinks big American buyers are still in play, pointing to the $1 billion Taylor Sheridan NBC Universal deal as proof that the media giants are willing to pay big bucks. I can make a case for any streamer wanting to create a foothold in a world with a pre-existing fan base, he adds. If I'm Paramount right now, I'm losing Taylor Sheridan in 2029, and so thinking about IP, what else can I buy from a streamer? They must be putting their heads together. This is also a good point. Even though, you know, Doctor Who was dropped by Disney, it's worth saying that the name itself of Doctor Who has some level of like brand recognition, and in the streaming wars, it's not impossible for another streaming service to pick it up. I think though, if there is going to be one, I think the BBC are going to be considerably more cautious about another deal than they were with this one, perhaps learning from their mistakes. We might see something more akin to previous HBO deals, for example. Not that it will necessarily be with HBO, I don't know, but more so that it'll just be, yeah, Doctor Who's playing on HBO in America, and that'll kind of be it. It won't be like this partnership kind of thing where they are more directly involved. Coincidentally, Doctor Who's first 13 seasons have recently come off HBO Max in the US, meaning a deal could be done for the entire series. Our BBC Studios insider argues that Disney's indifference to Doctor Who may prove a blessing in disguise. I don't think in the States that there is a real association with Doctor Who and Disney, except for the fact that the last 2 seasons were on Disney+. We're talking about a show that has relaunched many different times and shown up in many different places. So there you go, that's kind of it really, and a lot of interesting stuff to dissect there. Obviously, the most interesting stuff from me came from the Disney executive saying that, you know, obviously from them it wasn't seen as like a long-term kind of investment, despite, you know, BBC people kind of saying otherwise. This does kind of give me the sense though, and I got the sense from the press release as well, the BBC really did want to do right by Doctor Who this time. You know, they went out and they found a big streamer, and look, it's hard to give them props, you know, because the BBC are constantly under fire, but I think in this case, they really did want Doctor Who to do well. They brought back someone who they saw as a fandom favourite, someone with good name brand recognition, someone with a good reputation. They got a deal with probably what is the biggest streaming partner they could have gotten. I do think they wanted it to be a success, and I do think they wanted it to do well. And I think the fact that, you know, this BBC executive is saying, like, this BBC Studios executive, sorry, is saying that, you know, other big buyers could be in play, that's a good sign, you know, and I do think that there will be an interest from other streamers, especially with what they say towards the end, with the back catalogue also running out on HBO Max. That will probably make the deal more enticing for potential buyers, because even if the new stuff doesn't necessarily light the world on fire, Doctor Who's back catalogue is a significant part of its appeal. Obviously, the interesting thing is obviously talking about the reasons as to why Disney may have left, and obviously one of the reasons being, you know, obviously the first one they said it's never really like a long-term thing, which I don't really know whether I buy. The other being low ratings. Obviously we don't know the actual Disney Plus ratings, but I can imagine that they weren't really a patch on Marvel and Star Wars, but to be honest, anyone could have told you that. Like, Doctor Who is big, sure, it's not Star Wars or Marvel big, and I think expecting it to do that was always probably slightly naive. The other thing, obviously, is the changes in America geopolitically as well, which is probably worth mentioning, could have played a part. But I think more likely it was the change in leadership over at Disney and the decisions to cut back spending, which was probably the biggest factor, I would hazard a guess as to say. So in the end, it kind of just seems like a sort of confluence of factors, you know, the ratings not being particularly great, you know, it's just not really a priority for them particularly. They've got other stuff going on, and, you know, a new CEO coming in during the deal who wanted to cut back. And when you look at what they have to cut back, Doctor Who is one of the most obvious things to do. They don't own it, you know, they don't make a ton of money from it. Cut it. You know, that's how these businesses work at the end of the day. But, yeah, I do genuinely believe the BBC wanted to do right by it this time. I think that they wanted it to do well. It's just a shame that this didn't work out. And, yeah, I mean, as this points out, you know, we could be in a situation where we have a new showrunner for 2027. And it'll be interesting to see whether the BBC goes with someone else, as in a new streamer, for that person, or whether it is, you know, just a BBC joint exclusively. BBC and BBC Studios co-funding it together, which I wouldn't even hate. If this is true, and it's like 2.53 million per episode, which I believe is about the same as what Jodie got, I'm fine with that. Whether the BBC can afford that, I don't know. But if that's what it does turn out to be, a more low-budget affair, I actually think that might work out for the best. But let me know what you guys think. If you did enjoy the video, please do give it a like. I appreciate that it's a bit of a longer one today. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you later.